On the outskirts of a forgotten town, isolated in the midst of a dense forest of ancient oaks, stood the Mansion of Nightmares. For centuries, no one dared to approach, and the few brave souls who tried never returned. Legends say the mansion harbored indescribable horrors, feeding on the deepest fears of those who entered its doors. It was a cold, foggy night when a group of 5 friends decided to challenge local superstitions. Eduardo, Clara, Enrique, Mariana, and Pedro, young and skeptical, sought thrills and the promise of a macabre adventure. They ignored the villagers' warnings and headed towards the mansion, armed only with flashlights, cameras, and reckless courage. Crossing the rusty, creaky gate, they felt a shiver run down their spines. The full moon, shrouded by dark clouds, cast dancing shadows over the grounds. The wind whistled through the trees, emitting an almost human wail. They advanced through the abandoned garden, where statues worn and distorted by time seemed to watch them with empty gazes. The main door, a massive wooden structure adorned with grotesque figures, creaked loudly as it opened, as if awakening from a long sleep. The air inside was dense, laden with the smell of mold and something else, something metallic. Eduardo led the group into the silent darkness of the hall. The walls were covered with faded tapestries depicting scenes of torture and pain, each more disturbing than the last. Clara, the most sensitive of the group, began to feel nauseated. She felt as if something was watching them from the shadows. "Let's explore the upstairs first," suggested Enrique, trying to break the growing tension. They climbed the marble staircase, the steps creaking under their feet as if protesting their presence. On the second floor, they found a series of rooms. They opened a door and discovered an old child's room. A crib in the center of the room was covered in dust and cobwebs. Mariana approached, shining her flashlight inside the crib, only to find a teddy bear with eyes that seemed to follow her movements. She felt a chill and quickly stepped back. Pedro, who had always been the most skeptical, began to laugh nervously. "This is ridiculous. There's nothing here but old junk and our imagination." But his laughter was interrupted by a distant sound, a low, almost imperceptible wail coming from somewhere below them. They decided to investigate the basement. They descended a narrow, steep staircase, the steps slippery with moisture. The air grew heavier with each step, and the darkness seemed to devour them. At the bottom of the stairs, a heavy iron door stood out, covered in inscriptions none of them could decipher. When they opened it, a wave of fetid air hit them, almost making them turn back. The basement was a labyrinth of narrow corridors and sinister chambers. They found a room lined with white tiles stained with dried blood. In the center was a rusty operating table, covered with old, macabre surgical instruments. Eduardo felt rising panic and suggested they leave. But before they could decide, the flashlight beams began to flicker and then went out. The darkness was total. They could hear their own labored breathing and the rapid beating of their hearts. Suddenly, a deafening scream echoed through the basement, followed by the sound of something quickly dragging towards them. Clara was the first to feel a cold, sticky hand grab her ankle. She screamed, but the sound was muffled as she was dragged into the darkness. The others ran, but there was no escape. They were trapped in an endless nightmare, where each corridor led to more horrors. Enrique stumbled over something soft and, illuminating it with his trembling flashlight, saw Clara's face, pale and lifeless, her eyes wide in frozen terror. Eduardo tried to stay calm but could hear whispers in his mind, ancient, cursed words. Pedro, completely terrified, separated from the group, entering a narrow corridor that seemed to close in around him. He felt something warm trickling down his neck and, touching it, realized he was bleeding. There was no visible wound, but the blood kept flowing, as if the mansion itself was draining his life. Mariana, now alone, found a partially open door. She entered and discovered a library filled with old, dusty books. She felt a presence behind her, but when she turned, nothing was there. She flipped through one of the books and saw images of ancient rituals, sacrifices, and invocations. The pages seemed alive, pulsing under her fingers. Suddenly, the door slammed shut with a loud bang. The bookshelves began to shake, books falling and scattering on the floor. Mariana tried to scream, but her voice was silenced. She felt invisible hands grabbing her body, pulling her into one of the dark corners of the room. Her silent screams echoed in the mansion, but no one could hear her. The mansion, satisfied with its new souls, returned to silence, patiently waiting for its next group of unsuspecting visitors. And so, the Mansion of Nightmares continued its grim vigil, a living entity that fed on fear and despair, eternally hungry for more victims. The few who survived the first night in the mansion were never the same. Eduardo, Enrique, and Pedro, now marked by invisible scars, found themselves in a constant state of panic, their minds shattered by the horrors they had witnessed. They knew that the only way to escape the nightmare was to uncover the deepest secrets of the mansion. Eduardo, determined to save what was left of his friends, led the group back to the main hall. There, they found an old, dusty portrait of a severe and sinister-looking man, with eyes that seemed to follow them. "He is the key," Eduardo murmured, not knowing exactly why. The moon, still obscured by dark clouds, cast unsettling shadows through the dust-covered windows. They felt a chilling presence as they passed the portrait, and a soft, almost imperceptible whisper echoed through the hall. Enrique, with trembling hands, pointed to a small key hanging on a chain around the man's neck in the portrait. The key to get out of here must be with him. The trio climbed the stairs again, this time more cautiously, their flashlights illuminating every dark corner. On the third floor, they found a locked room. The key from the portrait did not fit the lock, but Enrique, in a moment of desperation, kicked the door with force. The old wood gave way with a loud crack, revealing a dusty office filled with ancient books and scrolls. Pedro, who had become more silent and distant since Clara's death, began to leaf through one of the scrolls. His eyes widened as he read about ancient rituals of invocation and sacrifice. "They used the mansion as a portal to something terrible," he murmured, his voice broken with fear. Suddenly, the floor trembled, and a crack opened in the middle of the room. A smell of sulfur emanated from the opening, followed by an unbearable heat. Something was beginning to emerge from the depths, a creature made of shadows and flames, its eyes glowing with malice. Eduardo pulled Pedro and Enrique out of the room, running down the narrow corridor. Behind them, the creature followed, its sharp claws scraping the walls, emitting a deafening sound. They stumbled down the stairs, feeling the infernal heat closing in on them. In the hall, they faced the main door, now sealed by an invisible force. Eduardo remembered the portrait and ran to it, tearing the key from the chain. "Quick, we need to find the right lock," he shouted, as the mansion trembled around them. They ran to the library, where Mariana had disappeared. At the back of the room, they found a bookshelf that seemed out of place. Eduardo inserted the key into a small hidden lock, and the bookshelf opened, revealing a secret passage. Without a second thought, they entered the passage, which closed immediately behind them, isolating them from the creature. The tunnel was narrow and cold, illuminated only by their flickering flashlights. As they advanced, the whispers intensified, now audible and almost comprehensible. "They are with us," Pedro said, his voice filled with deep terror. At the end of the tunnel, they found a circular room with an altar in the center. On the altar was an ancient leather-bound book, covered in arcane symbols. Eduardo opened the book and began to read aloud, feeling a strange energy envelop them. The walls of the room started to vibrate, and the whispers turned into agonizing screams. The mansion, seeming aware of their actions, began to disintegrate, its foundations crumbling and the roof collapsing. Eduardo kept reading, his eyes burning with effort, while Pedro and Enrique held hands, forming a circle around the altar. When Eduardo uttered the final words of the ritual, an explosion of light enveloped them. They felt as if they were being pulled out of reality through a vortex of darkness and light. Suddenly, everything went silent. When they opened their eyes, they found themselves in the mansion's garden, now in ruins. The sun was beginning to rise on the horizon, dispelling the night's shadows. They felt exhausted but relieved to be alive. But something was wrong. As they looked around, they noticed that the forest surrounding the mansion was dead. The trees transformed into charred skeletons. And then they heard a final whisper, soft as the wind. "You may have escaped, but the mansion will always find new souls to devour." They knew that, despite having survived, they would never be the same. They would forever carry the scars of the horrors they had faced in the Mansion of Nightmares. The survivors, Eduardo, Enrique, and Pedro, sat on the hard, scorched ground, breathing heavily. The rising sun cast a faint light over the devastated landscape. The ruins of the mansion still exuded an aura of evil, like a rotting corpse that refused to decay. Eduardo, still holding the ancient book, began to flip through the pages, searching for answers. "We need to seal this place forever. We can't let others suffer what we did," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. Enrique, struggling against fear and exhaustion, agreed. "But how? We don't have any strength left, and what we've done so far was only temporary. We need something permanent." Pedro, silent since their last escape, looked at his friends and, with a grim expression, pointed to the book. "There's a final ritual here, a sacrifice, but someone has to stay behind." Silence fell over them, heavy and suffocating. They all knew what it meant. Finally, Eduardo broke the silence. "I'll do it. It was my idea to come here. My fault that everyone is dead or traumatized. I can't let you pay for this." Enrique and Pedro tried to argue, but Eduardo was adamant. "You need to get out of here. Tell the world what happened. Make sure no one else falls into this trap." With tears in their eyes, Enrique and Pedro said goodbye to Eduardo. Finding a new path through the rubble, they discovered a trail leading back to the town. They promised each other they would return with help to ensure the mansion was destroyed once and for all. Eduardo, now alone, returned to the makeshift altar he had found. He prepared the ingredients as described in the book: blood, ashes, and the ancient words of closure. As he began the ritual, he felt the mansion's malevolent presence intensify, as if resisting his attempt to seal it. He recited the final words with determination, despite the growing fear. The ground around him began to shake violently. The ruins of the mansion started to be sucked into a dark vortex, forming at the center of the altar. Eduardo felt intense pain, as if his very soul was being pulled out of his body. As he uttered the last syllable, an explosion of light enveloped him, blinding him completely. He felt himself being torn from his reality, plunged into a cold, infinite darkness. Enrique and Pedro, now at a safe distance, saw the explosion of light and then the total collapse of the mansion. When they returned to the site days later, accompanied by authorities and experts, they found only a dark void where the mansion once stood. The ground was barren and dead, as if nothing had ever grown there. They told their stories, but few believed them. The site was isolated and declared off-limits. Enrique and Pedro, forever marked by the experience, dedicated their lives to researching supernatural phenomena, seeking to understand and prevent others from meeting the same fate. Eduardo, now lost in the darkness between worlds, became a legend. Some say he still guards the entrance to the nightmare, preventing the mansion's evil from returning. Others believe he is a wandering spirit, trapped between realities, eternally vigilant. And so, the Mansion of Nightmares was sealed, but its legacy of terror and suffering continued to haunt those who dared to remember. Even in the apparent peace, a distant whisper could always be heard on the wind. The mansion will always find new souls to devour.